What if you were told that the greatest minds of the Third Reich built a crippled airplane, a machine doomed from its very birth, not due to a bad engine or weak armament, but because it violated the main sacred law of aviation, the law of symmetry? This aircraft had only one eye shifted to the side and one wing that held two completely different fates in the balance. Imagine the reaction of Luftwaffe generals when they were shown the blueprints in 1938. They couldn't believe their eyes. One of them shouted that this ugly contraption would kill the pilot on its very first flight. Another called the designer insane. But this madman was a genius who had survived the trenches of the First World War. He knew a terrible secret about conventional aircraft and created a monster to fix it. This video is the story of the strangest and most audacious weapon of World War II. An aircraft that came out victorious from secret trials, humiliating the classic machines of the Reich's best aces, received personal approval from one of the most influential Nazis and the fierce hatred of another, even more powerful one. Won a state contract for 500 units only to be betrayed and forgotten without firing a single shot. But behind the external strangeness lies a dark truth. Every single advantage of this aircraft turned against it. Its pride, the enormous glass canopy, became a mass grave for the crew. Its ingenious design made production impossible under wartime conditions, and the most crushing blow against it was dealt not by Russian fighters or American anti-aircraft guns, but by other German bombers. How is this possible? Why was a project approved at the highest level quietly destroyed by its own system? And where did all the built copies disappear to, as if erased from the face of the earth? This is not just a tale of another Wunderwaffe. This is the story of how engineering genius collided with the madness of bureaucracy, the brutality of real war, and the ruthless logic of a totalitarian machine. An aircraft that could have changed the course of aerial reconnaissance, but instead became the most enigmatic ghost of the Luftwaffe. Watch till the end. The truth turned out to be stranger than any myth. 1938, Berlin. A deathly silence reigned in the sterile office of the Imperial Ministry of Aviation, broken only by the rustle of paper. A group of high-ranking officials stood frozen over the blueprints spread on the table. Their faces, usually expressing cold confidence, gradually paled. What they saw was unthinkable. It defied not only the canons of aircraft construction, but also the basic principles of common sense. Before them lay the project of an aircraft whose layout provoked instant revulsion. The crew cabin was ruthlessly shifted to the right, while the powerful engine was placed on the left, creating a deliberate, provocative asymmetry. One of those present, unable to contain his emotions, grabbed his head, exclaiming that such a machine would never leave the ground, and if it did, it would immediately flip over and crash. The silent nods of the others were a damning verdict. But the author of this flying paradox, 40-year-old designer Richard Vogt, stood unshaken. His face was a stone mask, behind which lay unshakable confidence. This man knew what real danger was. He had survived the trenches of the First World War, flown fragile biplanes over the front lines. The official's words could not break him. In aviation circles, Vogt had earned a solid reputation as a stubborn visionary, a man who sought revolutionary solutions where others saw only dead ends. The blueprint he presented was not a mistake, but a conscious challenge.
But what if this madness contained genius? What if Vogt saw what the adherents of tradition could not, fundamental flaws hidden for decades in the very foundation of conventional, symmetrical aviation?
Vogt's logic was like an explosion in the axiomatic world of aviation engineering. While his colleagues perfected familiar forms, he dared to question their very foundation, the dogma of symmetry. All aircraft, from training biplanes to the latest fighters, were built according to an unshakable canon: engine in the nose, cockpit behind it, wings on the sides. Vogt saw in this seemingly perfect scheme an imperfection, a whole complex of forced compromises that were tolerated only because no other way was known. He mentally divided the problems of the traditional layout into three fronts. The first, visibility. The pilot and observer in a reconnaissance machine were essentially trapped in a cockpit behind a massive engine and fuel tanks. The giant aircraft nose created a blind spot, blocking the forward down and forward up sectors, precisely the sectors critical for observing the ground and sky. The second front, aerodynamics. The powerful airflow from the propeller, rotating at tremendous speed, created a turbulent wake that battered the rudder and elevator like an invisible blacksmith's hammer, reducing stability and control precision. And finally, the third, most insidious enemy, physics. The engine torque constantly, relentlessly tried to rotate the fuselage around its axis. The pilot was forced to wage an endless, exhausting duel with the control column, making corrections to keep the machine flying straight. It turned out that an outwardly perfectly symmetrical aircraft behaved in flight like a capricious, asymmetrical system. And then, Vogt had an idea that could only be called a brilliant heresy. What if instead of fighting these forces, we tamed them? Not mask the imbalance, but accept it as a fundamental condition and build a counterbalance into the very design from the start. His solution was elegant in its audacity. Consciously create an asymmetrical aircraft to achieve perfect balance in flight. He proposed splitting the machine into two separate modules. On the left, a streamlined engine nacelle extended into its own mini fuselage all the way to the tail. On the right, a spacious, fully glassed cabin for a crew of 3, providing panoramic visibility without a single obstruction. These two modules were connected by a single, solid wing whose geometry and aerodynamic profile were calculated with jeweler's precision so that the lift distribution perfectly compensated for the offset center of gravity. This was not a cosmetic fix, but a complete rethinking of flight architecture. However, to embody such heresy in metal required not just a boss, but an ally, almost as much of a dreamer. That man was Walter Blom, head of the firm Blom & Voss, known for its flying boats. Blom looked far beyond the horizon of the war. He was fascinated by the prospect of peaceful transoceanic airliners. In Vogt's daring project, he saw not just a military machine, but a breakthrough, a revolution that could forever inscribe his company's name in aviation history. It was his faith and resources that allowed work to begin, even though the official ministry order for their participation in the competition never arrived. Thus, the prototype designated BV-144 was born. Its appearance shocked even seasoned mechanics. But all these complex calculations, blueprints, and rational arguments now had to pass the ultimate test. The most impartial and strict judge, the air itself, awaited its turn. And with it waited the man whose will and skill were to become the final argument in the dispute between madness and genius. What would a pilot experience when lifting this seemingly unnatural contraption into the air for the first time?
When the first BV-141 prototype was rolled onto the airfield in late autumn 1938, a tense, almost oppressive silence fell, broken only by whispers and the screech of tires on concrete. The machine in metal looked even more surreal than on the blueprints. It didn't just challenge aesthetics, it seemed physically implausible, as if two different, incompatible craft, a light reconnaissance plane and a heavy fighter, had been forcibly fused by a common wing. The mechanics and engineers who assembled it gave it a wide berth. Among the technical staff, quiet, grim arguments ensued. Some bet the plane simply wouldn't take off. Others predicted an immediate roll and spin to the side right after liftoff. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation of failure. At the calm center of this storm was the test pilot. Approaching the machine, he circled it long and silently, his experienced eye searching for the slightest flaw, trying to find some logic in this jumble of forms. His face was inscrutable, but his eyes betrayed deep distrust. Climbing into the right-shifted cockpit, he found himself alone in his transparent aquarium, while to his left, behind a thin bulkhead, sat the roaring engine, the heart of this asymmetry. It seemed nature itself would rebel against such an affront to the laws of aerodynamics. The engine roared, the propeller became a shimmering disk. The plane, unnaturally lopsided on the ground, began its takeoff run. Every second of increasing speed was agonizing. Everyone present froze, staring at the contraption, expecting something to give way at any moment, the landing gear or that chimeric wing. But the machine, contrary to all predictions, held straight. And then, smoothly, almost gracefully, its nose lifted, and the wheels left the concrete. The critical moment arrived, the very moment after which, according to skeptics, a chaotic tumbling should follow. Yet the BV-141 continued to gain altitude steadily and confidently, as if it had been built according to this scheme for decades. In the sky, it no longer looked like a freak, but like some new, frighteningly logical type of flying machine. The pilot circled the airfield, performed a series of standard maneuvers, and, to everyone's astonishment, made a flawless landing. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his face was pale with adrenaline, but his eyes burned. He silently removed his helmet, scanned the crowd, and uttered the words that became the verdict on skepticism. This thing, it flies, and it flies predictably. The visibility is fantastic. This was not just an admission, it was a revelation. The machine deemed doomed not only flew, but demonstrated its claimed advantages. Triumph on the airfield was absolute. However, this success was merely a ticket to the next, far more dangerous round. Now, the asymmetrical plane had to conquer not the air, but the corridors of power in the Ministry of Aviation. It had to secure the support of the mighty and face the conservatism and intrigue that posed a much greater threat than the laws of physics. Whose influence would become its shield, and whose hostility would prove an insurmountable barrier? News of the flying freak quickly reached the highest floors of the Luftwaffe. Here, the BV-141 gained a powerful patron, Colonel General Ernst Udet, a legendary ace of the First World War and now head of the technical office. Udet was a pilot to the core. He was interested in practical utility, not dogma. After personally flying the prototype, he was stunned by the unprecedented visibility from the cockpit and the crisp handling. In the BV-141, Udet saw the perfect instrument for a reconnaissance plane, something that could give the Army a real advantage on the battlefield. With the enthusiasm of a fighter, he began promoting the project, seeing in it the future of tactical aerial reconnaissance. However, an immovable wall stood in his path, in the person of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. For Göring, a vain man deeply conservative in technical matters, the asymmetrical aircraft was nothing more than a circus trick, a toy for eccentrics.
His sympathies lay with traditional, proven solutions. In particular, he openly favored the competitor, the FW-189, Uhu, Owl, by Focke-Wulf. This machine, though it violated the initial requirements by being twin-engined, had a familiar and elegant twin-boom layout with a central glazed gondola. In Göring's eyes, it looked like the proper weapon for the Reich. The fate of the competing concepts was decided in comparative trials in the spring of 1940. The BV-141, piloted by the best flyers, demonstrated its key advantage. Its single-engine layout was simpler, cheaper to produce, and consumed less fuel than the twin-engined Uhu. But the main trump card remained visibility. Vogt's panoramic cabin provided the crew not just with good, but with total, all-round visibility without blind spots, which was invaluable for a reconnaissance plane. Even skeptical officers on the Acceptance Commission were forced to admit the freak's superiority in this parameter. Under strong pressure from UDET and based on positive reports, the Ministry of Aviation made an unexpected turn. It placed a grandiose order of 500 BV-141 aircraft. This was the crowning hour of Richard Vogt and Walter Blom. Their idea, recently ridiculed, received the highest approval and a green light for mass production. It seemed asymmetry had won. Factory floors began to be reconfigured for the new assembly line, and military strategists were already making plans for how squadrons of these unseen machines would spy on the fortifications of future enemies. However, this story had a cruel nuance that everyone missed in the heat of triumph. A demonstration flight and war are two different universes. One thing is to impress a commission on a well-maintained range, and quite another is to survive in the sky, where bullets, anti-aircraft fire, and harsh frontline realities await you. And it was there, on the path to serial production and combat use, that the flaws of the asymmetrical genius, meek during trials, were destined to grow into fatal, insurmountable shortcomings.
News of the flying freak quickly reached the highest floors of the Luftwaffe. Here, the BV-141 gained a powerful patron, Colonel General Ernst Udet, a legendary ace of the First World War and now head of the technical office. Udet was a pilot to the core. He was interested in practical utility, not dogma. After personally flying the prototype, he was stunned by the unprecedented visibility from the cockpit and the crisp handling. In the BV-141, Udet saw the perfect instrument for a reconnaissance plane, something that could give the Army a real advantage on the battlefield. With the enthusiasm of a fighter, he began promoting the project, seeing in it the future of tactical aerial reconnaissance. However, an immovable wall stood in his path in the person of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. For Göring, a vain man, deeply conservative in technical matters, the asymmetrical aircraft was nothing more than a circus trick, a toy for eccentrics. His sympathies lay with traditional, proven solutions. In particular, he openly favored the competitor, the FW-189, Uhu, or Owl, by Focke-Wulf. This machine, though it violated the initial requirements by being twin-engined, had a familiar and elegant twin-boom layout with a central glazed gondola. In Göring's eyes, it looked like the proper weapon for the Reich. The fate of the competing concepts was decided in comparative trials in the spring of 1940. The BV-141, piloted by the best flyers, demonstrated its key advantage. Its single-engine layout was simpler, cheaper to produce, and consumed less fuel than the twin-engined Uhu, but the main trump card remained visibility. Vogt's panoramic cabin provided the crew not just with good, but with total, all-round visibility without blind spots, which was invaluable for a reconnaissance plane. Even skeptical officers on the Acceptance Commission were forced to admit the freak's superiority in this parameter.
Under strong pressure from UDET and based on positive reports, the Ministry of Aviation made an unexpected turn. It placed a grandiose order of 500 BV-141 aircraft. This was the crowning hour of Richard Vogt and Walter Blom. Their idea, recently ridiculed, received the highest approval and a green light for mass production. It seemed asymmetry had won. Factory floors began to be reconfigured for the new assembly line, and military strategists were already making plans for how squadrons of these unseen machines would spy on the fortifications of future enemies. However, this story had a cruel nuance that everyone missed in the heat of triumph. A demonstration flight and war are two different universes. One thing is to impress a commission on a well-maintained range, and quite another is to survive in the sky, where bullets, anti-aircraft fire, and harsh frontline realities await you. And it was there, on the path to serial production and combat use, that the flaws of the asymmetrical genius, meek during trials, were destined to grow into fatal, insurmountable shortcomings.
The euphoria from the order quickly gave way to a cold, technical hangover. As engineers delved into preparing serial production and military pilots got to know the machine better, problems invisible under ideal test conditions began to surface. The main advantage, the spacious glazed gondola, turned into a terrible vulnerability. In combat, this transparent cockpit became a death trap. The pilot, observer, and gunner sat exposed, perfectly visible to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft gunners. Any fragment or burst of fire could turn the aquarium into a bloody mess. For potential crews, this phenomenal visibility began to evoke not delight, but soul-chilling fear. No armor could adequately protect such a large area of glass, and the psychological pressure on pilots was colossal. Simultaneously, purely technical nightmares emerged. The airflow from the propeller, traveling a complex path due to the offset engine, created chaotic turbulence that furiously battered the tail assembly. This not only made control difficult. At high speeds, the rudder was literally torn from the pilot's hands, forcing him into an exhausting struggle to maintain course. Engineers tried to solve the problem by changing the shape and area of the control surfaces, but each such change disrupted the delicate balance of the entire asymmetrical design, creating new, unforeseen stability problems. The production process itself turned into a logistical hell. Asymmetry meant that the left and right parts of the aircraft were not mirror images. Almost every part, from attachment points to skin panels, was unique, required separate tooling, and could not be interchangeable. This catastrophically complicated and increased the cost of assembly, making the fast pace demanded by war impossible. An assembly line tuned for stamping identical parts could not efficiently work with such a bespoke design. The BV-141 turned out to be not a mass-produced soldier, but a capricious, expensive single item requiring hand finishing. The project, so recently triumphant, now balanced on a razor's edge. Its technical flaws and production complexity outweighed its tactical advantages. And at this moment, the decisive, fatal blow came from where no one expected it, from the other side of the globe, from events having no direct relation to the BV-141 whatsoever. The fate of the Luftwaffe's strangest aircraft was decided not in the design bureau, not in the skies over the test range, but in the offices of the High Command, where resources were counted, and one project was crossed off to save another.
The fatal blow to the project was dealt not by an enemy fighter, but by strategic necessity, which became apparent in 1942. Allied aviation conducted a series of massive raids on German industry. One of the key targets was the Focke-Wulf plant in Bremen, which produced the huge four-engined long-range reconnaissance aircraft and bombers FW-200 Condor. These aircraft were vital to the Reich. They hunted convoys in the Atlantic, conducted strategic reconnaissance, and, not insignificantly, one of the Condors served as Adolf Hitler's personal transport. Allied bombers practically wiped the plant off the map, halting production of these critically important machines. Panic erupted at the High Command headquarters. Condors were needed immediately. And then the gaze of military officials fell upon Blom and Voss. The firm had spare capacity, experience with large aircraft, albeit flying boats, and a disciplined workforce. An order arrived, broking no argument. Immediately cease all in-house developments and completely switch to licensed production of the FW-200 Condor. This was the iron logic of total war. One strategic bomber was valued above a dozen tactical reconnaissance planes, however revolutionary. For the BV-141, this was the final and merciless verdict, delivered not by its own shortcomings, but by someone else's bombs and higher expediency. The grandiose order for 500 machines was quietly cancelled. All resources, workshops, and personnel were redirected to assembling someone else's design. The several BV-141s already built became unwanted. They quietly rusted on the backlots of airfields, never making a single combat sortie. There were plans to send them to the Eastern Front, but these plans were never realized. Thus, the career of the Luftwaffe's most unusual aircraft ended not with a loud failure in battle, but with a quiet administrative closure. It became a victim of circumstance, a pawn sacrificed in the vast machinery of war. But what became of its material legacy, and more importantly, of the genius who dared to create it? Did these machines vanish without a trace? And what was the fate of Richard Vogt when the world for which he created collapsed?
When the dust from the last battles of World War II began to settle, specialists from the Allied nations were presented with a strange picture of the Third Reich's technical legacy. Among the familiar Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they found real curiosities, and one of the most astonishing was the fragments of that very asymmetrical aircraft, the BV-141. British and American engineers, having obtained several damaged specimens, subjected them to the most thorough analysis. Their conclusion, recorded in technical reports, was one of cold professionalism and respectful amazement. They confirmed Vogt's aerodynamic calculations were flawless, the concept of deliberate asymmetry to compensate for torque, brilliant, and the provided visibility indeed had no equal. However, their verdict was merciless, a brilliant engineering solution unsuitable for the conditions of real combat use. The fragility of the enormous glazed gondola and the monstrous complexity of mass production under wartime conditions outweighed all theoretical advantages. Thus, the legacy of the BV-141 proved ephemeral. Of the roughly 20 machines built, including prototypes and pre-production models, not a single one survives. They were destroyed in combat, cannibalized by the Germans themselves for parts, or crushed under the tracks of Allied tanks. All that remains of one of the boldest ideas in aviation history are photographs, blueprints, and a few scattered parts in museum storerooms. The aircraft became a ghost, a technological myth, whose material confirmation is solely our knowledge that it once truly flew.
But if the machine's fate was sad, the fate of its creator was full of unexpected turns. Richard Vogt, whose talent did not fit into the Procrustean bed of the Nazi war machine, attracted the attention of American intelligence services. He became one of the prizes of the famous Operation Paperclip, in which the best German scientists and engineers were secretly brought to the United States to work for the American scientific industrial complex. For Vogt, this was not a defeat, but a new beginning. In the United States, his unconventional thinking, accustomed to breaking patterns, found unexpected application. He was taken into the Boeing Corporation, where his experience was in demand at the cutting edge of technological progress. It is known that Vogt participated in work on the boldest post-war projects, including concepts for strategic bombers with nuclear engines, machines meant to fly for weeks without landing. The irony of fate was that the man who created one of the most unusual aircraft of World War II now helped build machines meant for a hypothetical third. Therefore, the history of the BV-141 is far from a story of failure. It is a time capsule capturing the spirit of a contradictory era. The aircraft became the perfect symbol of German technomania, the unrestrained drive for innovation at any cost, the belief that engineering genius could overcome any laws, be they of physics or logistics. But it also most vividly illustrates the dead end this mania reached when confronted with the merciless pragmatism of total war, where quantity mattered more than quality, simplicity more than sophistication, and resources for capricious experiments ran out very quickly. The BV-141 did not win a single battle, did not become a terror of the skies, and did not enter textbooks as a model of efficiency, but it won its place in the pantheon of aviation history. It remains there as the most expressive, most memorable symbol of engineering audacity. Its ghostly silhouette reminds us not of how to build airplanes, but of how far human thought can go in search of an ideal, and how harshly surrounding reality can cut short even the most brilliant flight of fancy. It is an eternal reminder of the thin line between being ahead of its time and being unwanted, between courage and recklessness. And in this lies its eternal, bitter, and beautiful value.